Good morning. I'd like to welcome you to your 70th annual business meeting for the Iowa Institute for Cooperatives. I'm Doyle Anderson, your current president of the Iowa Institute. This has been quite a challenging year with everything we've been going through with the pandemic, and our lives have all changed. It seems like this spring when things got locked down, everything changed from week to week. There was something new every time we turned around every week. And we're still dealing with changes. And so this is our first Zoom meeting or webinar meeting we've had for an annual meeting. And hopefully it goes well today, so be patient with us. I'd like to thank our office staff and Nancy Sear and Katie Hall and Stacy Webster and Dave Holm for all the stuff they've done this whole past year, and appreciate everything they do for us. So I know my comments are kind of brief, but we're going to continue on and with our business meeting here. The Credentials Committee, chaired by Dave Hasselbrook, has determined that a sufficient number of voting delegates are present to constitute a quorum. Notice of the annual business meeting was mailed on October 23rd, 2020 to all members at their last known address. The minutes of the 2019 Iowa Institute annual meeting were included in the annual meeting notice. Is there a motion to approve the minutes from the last year's annual meeting? I see on the webinar there is. Is there a second? I see a second. There is a polling question that appears on your screen, and we will give you a few seconds to submit your vote. The motion passes. We will now receive a report from the Resolutions Committee chaired by Ruben Scow.
Thank you, Doyle. Mr. Chairman, on Friday, November 6th, the Iowa Institute for Co-ops met virtually in the committee room. We reviewed the current resolutions and approved the updated language for our legislative positions. Katie Hall, the Iowa Institute Director of Government Affairs, is going to review the updates and recommendations of the legislative committee. Katie?
Thank you, Ruben. I'm Katie Hall, the Director of Government Affairs. Let me just share my screen here. Oh. All right, we'll go ahead and get right into it. The review process is pretty simple. The Legislative Committee meets every year and we review our resolutions. We have 110 that get reviewed each year. New resolutions are proposed and the committee recommends changes. Those resolutions are really integral to what Mike St. Clair and I do at the Capitol. They help guide cooperative issues in both Des Moines and Washington, D.C. If you're interested in participating in the committee, certainly let us know. With that, I'll go ahead and thank the Legislative Committee this year. We had a great participation and lots of feedback. There were quite a few updates this year and edits to account for things that have happened in the past year. So thank you very much to that Legislative Committee for your time and dedication this year. A quick key as we go through it, the yellow highlight means that they were up for review. Those resolutions were last reviewed in 2015, and the blue ones are new edits or additions. And the asterisk is a duplicated resolution in both federal and state sections. The first resolution, expansion of renewable transportation fuels use. We added a supporting resolution that would allow us to support an expansion of infrastructure grant program to increase that grant funding to $100,000. Hours of service, we recommended to keep and edit that resolution to also include emergency situations, including supply shortages, pandemics, or other health emergencies during harvest each year. Community colleges, we support adequate funding and staffing levels for Iowa's community colleges and encourage coordination for training and cooperative employee development. The childcare cliff effect is a new one this year, and we support public policy that addresses the childcare cliff effect and makes childcare more affordable and accessible. Climate resiliency and greenhouse gas legislation and regulation. We included a provision that would allow us to support carbon credit programs even during acts of God. Pension plan premiums was updated this year to reflect legislation that was passed in the last year. 199A subsection G cooperative taxes was a new resolution that we added this year to address proposed rules from the Department of Treasury that would increase taxes on cooperatives. Naturally, that's something that we oppose, and we wanted to put it in our resolution book. From the electric sector, we modified federal taxes to also account for legislation that has recently passed. With that, we conclude our legislative update. Thank you.
As chairman of the Resolutions Committee, I move that we adopt the actions recommended by the Legislative Committee and provide our members with our current policy resolutions document by January 8th, 2021. Is there a second? I see a second. There is a polling question that has appeared on your screen. We will give you a few moments to submit your vote. The motion passes. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruben. We will now hear the remarks of Dave Holm, the Executive Director of the Iowa Institute for Cooperatives. Dave?
Thank you, Dawn. Give me a second to share my screen with you here. Thank you to everyone for joining us this morning. As Doyle mentioned, everything is different. As I sit here today, I think about last year at our annual meeting. If I would have said this is how we were going to be hosting our annual meeting this year, I'm pretty sure nobody would have understood the need for this. So we're all getting adjusted to new ways of doing things. Real quickly, most of you are familiar with us, but we're a trade association for cooperatives. Our members consist of all those types of co-ops you see listed on your screen. We have about 150 members each year. Your staff consists of these 5 people, and I can't thank them enough for the flexibility, creativity, and their ability to adjust to everything that's changed over the last 8 months. They've been terrific, and I can't thank them enough. I'd like to extend a special thank you to 3 board members that will be retiring from our board meeting after today. Naomi and Tom and Ron have done just a terrific job of supporting us, participation, and expressing their views of what the Iowa Institute should and could be doing for you. So once again, thank you to the 3 of them. I really appreciate your involvement and support. So our mission is to enhance your success. The only reason we exist is to help you succeed as a cooperative, and we want to be your valued partner. We have 4 value platforms that we try to deliver that on. Katie just reviewed our legislative and regulatory affairs. In a normal year, not this year, we provide about 20 programs to you targeted at staff members and board members. We provide business development resources, which includes our benchmarking service, merger and strategic planning sessions, and in-person meetings with your board. And as we've all come to recognize the value of networking, I think we all crave that ability to get in a room together, shake hands in person, and visit about best practices. Much like your business, everything that you see listed above has changed in how we provide that value. This pandemic has changed everything we thought we knew about how to provide value to you as our member cooperatives. Some of the challenges your board has been wrestling with. 40% of our revenue is non-dues based revenue. So those are those things that we do for you, our meetings, our in-person meetings, our benchmarking services that we provide for you. And as you would anticipate, that number has almost zeroed out basically since the 1st of March. So it's challenged us to find new ways to deliver that value to you while still generating revenue so that we can continue to operate. Like most things, COVID-19 interrupted everything about our schedule. Last year at this time, your board had made a commitment to do a deep dive into the strategic planning process. They committed the resources, the time, and the effort, and had actually set a timetable to complete that function by September of 2020. We have been unable to meet in person, so that entire process is bollocksed up by this whole COVID. I think more than ever, though, it's critical that we take time to do this. And like many of you, we are asking the same questions you are. How long is this going to last? I remember when this started last March, if you would have said we were going to be having our annual meeting this way in virtual 8 months later, I don't think anyone anticipated it lasting this long. The second question is, what does normal look like when we do start the recovery process? I don't think normal is going to look like it did. We've learned some things, and I think normal will be different regardless of when we start to recover from this. And last but not least, how do we continue to provide that value to you? What our mission statement says, help you succeed while still protecting our staff and your co-op board and staff with COVID-19 protocol. It's challenged all of us to find creative ways to do things. Some of the things we've already started, we are creating an online library of seminars that will be accessible at your convenience. Over the past 6 months, we've had probably 6 or 8 webinars that we've made available to you. We'll be putting those in that library that you can access at your convenience. And we're going to continue to develop that library so that when you want to go to watch a video or a webinar or a YouTube, it's available when you want it. We're not quite done with that yet. It's like everything else. We're kind of making this up as we go. We're in the process of developing that portal on our website, but it should be available to you in the next 30 to 60 days. That'll give you the convenience of accessing those when you want to. We started partnering with other cooperative councils. I would mention that on December 8th, 5 state councils from the Midwest are going to be hosting the Aim Point presentation, talking about not only the farmer of the future, but what does the farmer of the future look like post-pandemic? These are speakers that we can access working together that will be difficult for us to access alone. We've been holding small CEO groups, 3 to 4, so we can socially distance to still give you the opportunity to share best practices and interact with each other. But most importantly, we need your suggestions and input. When you exit the meeting today, you're going to get 6 polling questions. It's going to take you literally a minute or 2 to answer them. Please take a moment and give us suggestions on what you think we could and should be doing for you. But even more importantly, don't wait to take a polling question. If you have ideas or suggestions, reach out and let us know. We need your guidance and input on what you have that we could be doing for you to get you through this. There's reason for optimism, though. I think a lot of us have been stressed as we go through this. There's been a lot of mental anguish. Each year, the Iowa Institute awards at least 8 scholarships to young people who have spent their summer with you as an intern. This year, we awarded 10 of those. And I think it's very uplifting. I think it's very optimistic when we get an opportunity to listen to these young people. So take just a few minutes and listen to some of their comments.
Receiving the scholarship was a cherry on top to an already great experience I had working for a cooperative. It made me further understand what a cooperative truly believes in, and they truly do care about the community, making an impact on the future of agriculture.
For my past 2 internships with new cooperatives, I learned that they are truly farmer-focused and member-driven.
I talked to someone who walked up to me, they introduced themselves, and they asked me, have you ever worked for a cooperative before? They said that when you're working for a cooperative, it's so much more than just, making as much money as possible for the company and then calling it a day. The big thing that he pointed out was, it's making sure that you're providing the best experience for not only your members, but also for the employees that work for the cooperative.
Receiving the scholarship let me know that my hard work did not go unnoticed, and it provides me the skill set and the will to put my hard work towards everything I do in the future, especially in my future career opportunities.
Something that I found so unique about the cooperative structure is that it is for the members. Truly, this was something that was exemplified in my time at building and learning to make sure that all of their clients' needs are satisfied.
My internship this summer allowed me the opportunity to explore marketing and social media from a business perspective. I was able to grow as a professional as I developed skills to better promote farm source cooperatives, their values, and their products.
Something I learned on the job is that not everything works like it should on paper. Many processes, when implemented in the real world, require minor, unplanned adjustments.
Working for that cooperative system for the past 3 years, I have been able to grow a strong passion for serving the members and finding a career path that fits me. During the summer, I was able to see some of the things I had previously learned in a classroom applied to a cooperative like AGP.
This scholarship means so much to me, as it will allow me to attend grad school without having the burden of a lot of student debt.
I would like to say thank you to the Iowa Institute of Cooperatives for awarding me this scholarship and for supporting the students as we work towards reaching our goals.
As you watch those 10 young people, it has to rejuvenate you, create enthusiasm, and make you excited that that kind of talent is available. And as we start to come out of post-pandemic, that these people are going to bring new, creative, great ways of doing things that we can all learn from. This is a quote I saw in a presentation last week. I think it absolutely summarizes where we're all at. In our rush to return to normal, which we all want, I think we have to stop and think what part of normal is not worth rushing back to, and what part of this is an opportunity for us to just stop and pivot and say, you know, maybe the old normal isn't so good and new normal is okay. And I think we're all going to be faced with those decisions and challenges as we start to come out of this challenge. So thank you for joining us for your 70th annual meeting. Thank you for your membership and support. And most of all, thank you for your service to your cooperative. I know you don't get thank you often enough, but on behalf of all of us, I'd like to thank you for that. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Doyle.
Thank you, Dave, for your inspiring comments in this challenging year. And following our adjournment, we will be joined by Tom Halverson, the CEO of CoBank, to provide his perspective on the status of cooperatives and the business they conduct. I'd like to thank you for attending today, and I will adjourn the 70th annual meeting of the Iowa Institute for Cooperatives. Give us a few moments while we bring Tom into the meeting, and I'd like to say thank you.
We know that there were some challenges hearing that intern video. We will also be posting that on YouTube and sending that out for those of you that are interested in listening to those remarks or had issues hearing it today. Our guest speaker today is Tom Halverson. The presentation will be followed by a live Q&A with discussion. You'll be able to submit questions in the question section, and slides are available in the handout section. Attendees are muted, and the presentation will end at approximately noon. Thank you for your patience.
Good morning, Tom. Can you hear me?
Good morning. Yes, I can, Dave. Can you hear and see me okay?
Yes, technology is wonderful when it works, isn't it, Tom?
It certainly is.
Hey, Tom, I just want to take a moment before we start and thank you so much for spending a little time with us this morning. I really appreciate you carving out. I know you've got a really busy schedule, and I really like to thank you. But most importantly, Tom, I really want you to know it isn't just this hour we appreciate. We really appreciate the relationship and support CoBank provides for us all the time. So now, Tom, I'm going to do the obligatory introduction of you. So Tom Halverson serves as the president and CEO of CoBank. He is responsible for implementing the bank's strategic business direction. Previous to joining CoBank, Tom spent more than 15 years with Goldman Sachs, a $120 billion commercial bank. Tom's career has given him the opportunity to work in Europe and Asia and throughout the world. Tom is a graduate of Wabash College, and he earned his PhD in war studies from King's College, the University of London. So the way this is going to work is Tom's got a few slides he's going to click through and introductory comments. Those are available on your handout, and I think it also went out with the invitation to the link. So those are available to you. And then after Tom is done with his remarks, we're going to open it up. You can submit questions through the question tab on the webinar. And I've got a tablet here, and they'll show up when you submit them. So, Tom, you want to click through your slides?
I would love to. Thanks so much for the opportunity to be with you, quote unquote. I'm coming to you from my condominium in downtown Denver, and if I could pan around, you'd see that it's been snowing for about 8 hours. So we've got 3 or 4 inches of fresh snow outside the window, and you can see it resting on the glass over my head here. And I would tell you, I was trying to remember, Dave, when it was I last spoke to this group of leaders, and I can't remember whether it was 5 years ago or 6 years ago, but I certainly remember coming and having the opportunity to do that. And I think what I said then, I'm going to repeat now, which is one of the things that I should put on my resume for introductions in this group and with this group is the fact that the predominant epicenter of my family is in Wright County, Iowa. Both my parents were born and raised on farms just outside of Eagle Grove, where the majority of my relatives still are, aunts and uncles and cousins and the like, some of whom are farming our family farmland up there. So I have a lot of connectivity and have spent some of my youth in living and working on the farm in Iowa. So I get back there when I can, and I have a lot of relationships and fond thoughts for the great state of Iowa. And I'm delighted to be with all of you because you represent, Dave, all the industries that we serve at CoBank. And so happy to go through these slides. What I thought I would do here is talk about an issue that's a little bit down the road from the issues we're all struggling and grappling with right now, which, as you all are talking about, is COVID for obvious reasons, because it's so dislocated our personal lives and our professional lives and our businesses since early this year. For those of you who don't follow me on LinkedIn, you can see my LinkedIn URL on the bottom of this title page. And I would encourage you to go there because we post a lot of material there with views that I express on matters that are of interest, I hope, to our customers, whether it be on the economy, on trade, on other issues that are relevant to the customers and the industries that we serve. So I'm not sure, Dave, who's got the driver's wheel here, but if you want to go to the next page, we'll get right into the content. There we go. Thank you. This is the electoral map. We are, exiting the election and post-election period and entering the transition period, as we all know and are aware. There's, we are militantly nonpartisan at CoBank. We will work with people of any political stripe, party affiliation, or otherwise, as long as they're willing to work collaboratively with us in support of rural America in general and the industries that we serve in particular. But I would make a couple of introductory comments with respect to where we are as a country in terms of the results of the election, because it's really quite interesting. We see these kinds of maps. The one on the left is the results by state, and the one on the right is the results by county. The country is actually really, really interesting, and I say that as a retired political scientist by educational background. And on the one hand, you would think and seem as though we are incredibly partisan and that we are incredibly divided. And there's a certain amount of truth to that, but there is a great deal of differentiation that's of interest in the country. And since we have a quite unique electoral system with a first past the post system for presidential and other elections, whereby whoever gets the most votes gets everything. For the presidential elections at the state level, for congressional and Senate elections at the state and congressional district level. It's interesting to see that despite all of the debate, despite the volume and so forth of everything that we have been going through over this election season, and despite the record number of participants in the electoral process this year by historical terms, we are really a quite closely divided country, meaning the vote count is not even yet quite finished, but the zip code in which we have landed for the presidential election is about 51% for Biden and about 47 point something for Trump, which means with record numbers of people having participated in the election, we're only divided by between 3.5% and 4% at a national level. That's actually pretty close, even though this spread was pretty large, even by historical measures. The closeness of that national presidential election is often confusing or overlooked in the fact that we seem massively divided when you look at smaller sections, right? Many states and congressional districts aren't 51-47, they're 60-40 or something dramatically less competitive than we are at a national consolidated United States of America level. But one thing that I would note that's of interest, and we don't have exact data on this, but polling data, to the extent that it's directionally accurate, tells us that one of the divides that's of particular interest is the divide between rural and urban. And we at CoBank talk a lot about rural-urban divides, whether they be broadband penetration or healthcare provision or any number of other things where the metrics look different in rural America than they do in urban America. So too in voting preferences, at least, as I say, if exit polls are directionally accurate, 60% of urban America voted for Biden and 40% of rural America for Biden. And the reverse is true, obviously, for President Trump, who got 60%-ish of the rural vote and 40% of the urban vote. And that's a really interesting fact and a really interesting illustration of some of the tensions and some of the challenges that we face in support of rural America. And one of the things I've been talking a lot more about in recent weeks is the fact that the country is incredibly interdependent and sharing of mutual interests between and among urban and rural interests, and much more so than our political polarization would suggest. But I'll have more to say on that in other forums at a later date. So if you could turn the page, I want to move into the main substance of my comments. Now, we are in the throes of a global pandemic, and that global pandemic has caused the worst macroeconomic recession since the 1930s, when my father was a child, and so that's a big challenge. Sorry, if you could advance the page one, please.
Yeah, we're working on it, Tom.
Okay, no worries. And so I want to be very clear in saying right out of the box that everyone should agree and understand that we need to do everything that we can to address and eradicate COVID-19. And by doing so, that helps to address the terrible macroeconomic consequences of COVID-19. And that requires, as we have done this year, the alignment of fiscal and monetary policy authorities in this country to support the macroeconomy. So far, since March, that's actually a pretty good story. The monetary authorities, in terms of the Federal Reserve Board, have been very accommodative. The United States Congress and the President have signed several COVID relief bills, but we're coming to a point where that money is about to run out. So for example, 12 million people who are on unemployment benefits, their unemployment benefits will end at the end in a few weeks' time. And therefore we're in a situation in the absence of additional COVID relief that we could have a double dip recession and have a meaningful softening of macroeconomic activity. All that is to say that from my perspective, I think we need to continue to provide fiscal and monetary support until we get to the other side of COVID and we have a ubiquitous, safe, and effective vaccine that's been broadly distributed across the population. At that time, whenever that is, and I hope that's sooner rather than later, but I'm kind of soft circling the second half of 2021 as the timeline for that, and at which time extraordinary fiscal and monetary support can start to look different, and the economy might start to return to more normalized types of activities, although the economy itself will look different structurally, which I hope we can talk about in the question and answer period. But at that time, it will then be appropriate to start to think about and look at and reflect on how to respond to the question that you see on this page here, which is a graph showing the projected United States federal government budget deficit projected by the Congressional Budget Office, who are the official accountants for the United States Congress, who are responsible for the fiscal accounts of the federal government. I should probably have done this graph in red bars rather than yellow bars because these are negative numbers. And what you should take away from this chart is the fact that even before COVID-19 came on the scene, we were approaching at that point last year $1 trillion budget deficits. But this year, because of the deficit spending to provide fiscal support to the economy because of COVID-19, our budget deficit has absolutely skyrocketed, as you see, to $3.3 trillion. And across the next 10 years, the Congressional Budget Office is projecting deficits never to go below $1 trillion a year. These are truly extraordinary budget deficit numbers. Ordinarily, a responsibly managed industrial democracy like our own would never run budget deficits like this on a sustained basis. You would run budget deficits like this when you have a recession or a crisis of some kind, like a war or some other short-term thing, but you wouldn't run your government on a structurally negative basis of this magnitude. For reasons we're about to discover. If you could advance the page, please. The bottom line here is, of course, that the fiscal position of the federal government of the United States is dramatically imbalanced, and therefore likely that is an unstable trajectory, which has with it a variety of long-term risks for the financial well-being, not just of the federal government, but of the country as a whole. Now, when you run a large deficit, whether you're an individual or a company or the federal government of the United States, you may start at zero again on January 1st, but the accumulated deficit doesn't go away, it gets financed, right? And so what happens is the Treasury, borrows money in the capital markets to finance all those individual deficits that you saw on the preceding page. And all of that money gets piled onto the accumulated stack of existing liabilities of the federal government of the United States. And that shows up here. One of the things we do when we analyze the sustainability of the debt dynamics of governments and countries is we look at the percentage of government debt as a percentage of GDP. This is just the historical graph that shows U.S. government federal debt as a percentage of U.S. gross domestic product. This is obviously not compared to other peer rated countries around the world. But what this graph tells you, it goes all the way back to 1944, the second to last year of the Second World War. Obviously, we borrowed incredibly large amount of money from our own population in order to finance the war effort. Why did we do that? Because it was an existential crisis where we needed to get our hands on all the resources necessary to ensure the survival of the United States of America as an independent country in a death struggle with the Empire of Japan and Nazi Germany. And so we did what we had to do, and we borrowed an incredible amount of money that peaked out at the end of the war at over 100% of GDP. And then my parents' generation spent most of their adult working lives contributing to the sweating off of those liabilities up until the 1970s, when we drove that ratio down into the mid 20%. And ever since then, since I was before I joined the workforce and all my adult life, what our political leaders of both parties and both the executive branch and the Congress have progressively done, not in a straight line, but in a line of best fit over a 30-year period, have basically been re-leveraging the balance sheet of the United States government, particularly with two very dramatic spiked up increases that you can see here. One of which was the enormous budget deficit that were run after the financial crisis in 2007, 8, and 9, which substantially grew our debt because of the dramatic economic contraction, which intrinsically always causes a collapse of government revenue. That started to stabilize before COVID, but then when COVID came along, that last dramatic explosion, which you saw in the yellow line of $3.3 trillion budget deficit this year, is driving our accumulated stack of federal debt as a percentage of GDP back up to the levels not seen since the end of the Second World War. Now, you can all have your own opinions on whether that's reasonable and appropriate place for us to be. My own personal opinion is that I can understand why you would borrow that kinds of levels of money and make indebted your future generations when you're fighting for national survival against the Empire of Japan and Nazi Germany. It's harder for me to understand and accept the reasonableness of getting to that level of liabilities and exporting onto the backs of our children and grandchildren these liabilities, which my generation will never be able to pay off, not at a time of national survival, but just to ensure that we all can drive around nicer cars and live in nicer homes and consume more healthcare benefits and all the other things that we come to take for granted as our intrinsic rights to a certain quality of life. Now, these projections show us stabilizing out to 2030, but stabilizing at a really unprecedented level for peacetime in the United States. So if you could advance one more page, please, now that I'm getting you nervous. So what does this all mean is probably what you're asking yourself. Don't we have enough to feel concerned and anxious and depressed about thinking about COVID and its effects on the economy? Well, yes, you do, but the job of leaders, as I'm sure Dave would agree and you would all agree, is that you got to take you got to play the cards as they're dealt. You got to face the facts as they exist. You don't get to wish them away. And these are the financial and monetary facts in the medium and long-term future, and looking in the other direction isn't going to solve them. Now, let me turn to addressing the why should you, why should I, why should we care about these unsustainable debt dynamics at the federal government level. Well, one of the reasons is these two pie charts that I'm about to explain on the page in front of you. Right, last year, so call it right now, this is if you boil down the federal government in the United States, kind of boils down into three very, very broad categories. A couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to have Robert Gates, the former director of the CIA and the former Secretary of Defense of the United States, come speak at a CoBank customer event. And he used to jokingly say, well, the United States federal government is really just a gigantic worldwide insurance company with an army. And I scratched my head, and then he explained, and he's like, well, in fact, it's right. Most of the federal government is a variety of different risk management products provided to the population, healthcare and retirement income, for example, with a gigantic military complex on the side. And so that, if you look at these three colors in this pie chart, what you can see is the biggest one is that dark blue is mandatory. Those are all the things that we sometimes euphemistically describe as entitlement programs. In other words, they don't need to be authorized and have funds appropriated by the United States Congress in the budget process every year. They were done and approved decades ago. Social Security, for example, Medicare, for example. These are things that just happen like the sun rising in the east. We automatically spend that money because they are mandatory spending programs. And last year, you can see that when you sum them all together, they were 61.5% of all the federal government's expenditures. Discretionary, the little green wedge there of 30.1%, discretionary is all the stuff that every year the Congress has to authorize and appropriate and get the president to sign off on a turn a bill into law. And that there's a lot of stuff in the discretionary component, but it basically encompasses the budgets for all of the federal agencies, the entire Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, the Department of Interior, and things that you and I and we all care tremendously about that matter a lot to rural America in general, like the United States Department of Agriculture. If you sum all of these discretionary budgets together, you get to 30.1% of federal spending last year. And the last little widget there in light blue is interest payments. Since we had those historical budget deficits, which we've financed and racked up a very large amount of historical liabilities that you saw on the preceding page, we obviously, just to pay the interest payments, not the principal, just the interest payments right now are gobbling up 8.4% of all of our federal spending. And then if you step back and say, okay, but what happens if the CBO projections we looked at in the preceding pages come to pass? You get what you have on the right, which is to say the mandatory expenditure categories are relentlessly increasing. There's almost nothing you can do about that. So for example, 10,000 plus people per day hit the age of 65 and enter the Social Security system. The demographics of the country ensure that the mandatory slice of federal government spending will rise as surely the rest of my life, as surely as the sun rises in the east. And you can see what's happening is it's going to just continue to eat more of the pie. And for it to continue to eat more of the pie, one other thing that will also happen is if some form of the budget deficits that I just showed you materialize, we will accumulate the levels of debt that were on the preceding page. Those two things being true, then the servicing of the interest payments on that accumulated stack of borrowing will inevitably rise as surely as the sun comes up in the east. This projection, again from the Congressional Budget Office, shows that interest slice only going up 1%, and that's based on the dramatically important assumption that interest rates remain at exceptionally low levels for an exceptionally long period of time. If interest rates, for example, rose to more normalized levels over the next 5 years, i.e. 3-4% 10-year government bonds, for example, that 9.4% would grow dramatically. And if it did, which I don't expect it to, but if it did, or even if it didn't, the interest payment slice of the pie will continue to rise. Both of those things together being true means that the green wedge, which we care so much about, because it includes the Department of Agriculture and all the other discretionary spending that we care about, and that we frankly wouldn't really call discretionary, we'd call it essential, but from a budgeting perspective is discretionary. It doesn't have to happen. That discretionary wedge is going to be relentlessly squeezed. Almost no matter what we do, which means that it doesn't matter who's in the White House, doesn't matter who controls the House of Representatives, doesn't matter who controls the United States Senate. This will be the fiscal situation that we're in, this will be one of the biggest challenges that the federal government of the United States has to deal with over the next 5 to 10 years, regardless of who wins elections. And it is going to become a quite challenging proposition. I don't, you may ask yourself, well, why is nobody talking about this? Well, the answer is simply, this is a big, difficult problem for which there are no easy solutions or answers that are painless that people will find comforting. And therefore, you won't find any politicians of any political party who want to talk about it during an election campaign, because you don't win votes talking about a problem like this. You only make people nervous. And I expect that we're going to hear a lot more about it next year as we start to see COVID-19 start to simmer down, and the reality of this unrelenting mathematical problem starts to rise to the fore. So if you could advance one more page, please. Now, one of the most important factors, as I indicated a moment ago, that will determine how difficult and how quickly this problem starts to bear down on us is the question of what is the trajectory of interest rates. This is the famous dot plot, which is produced by the Federal Reserve Board of Governors on a quarterly basis. It is the confidential survey that they take of their voting members of the board of the Fed, where they ask them where they think short-term interest rates will be in the future. Each one of the dots on this graph represents the confidentially expressed opinions of a voting member of the Federal Open Market Committee about where they think interest rates will be in each of those time periods. They're not all-seeing beings, so they don't know what the future will be, but they are exceptionally well-informed and experienced people who know more than anyone else, and are therefore more likely to be accurate about this than you are or I am. And so this is interesting to look at, because it tells us that from the perspective of the voting members of the Federal Open Market Committee, they expect short-term interest rates to be exceptionally low all the way out through the business planning horizon. I don't know about your businesses, but in our business, we're right now having our board review and approve the budgets, the 2021 budget, but the 3-year budget goes out to 2023, end of 2023, and we look at this and we look at what's going on in the implied forwards in the financial markets, and they tell us that the most likely reality is, at least through 2023, interest rates will stay exceptionally low at the kinds of levels we're at now, which isn't to say that they couldn't go up 25 or 50 basis points, as you see here on the chart, in 2023. But we've got a 2 or 3 year period here where interest rates are going to stay exceptionally low, which means that the ability to borrow at unbelievably low levels, in fact, negative levels in real interest rate terms, because inflation exceeds bond yields, creates a very favorable market opportunity for borrowers. Now, on the one hand, that's a good thing. On the other hand, the conditions under which interest rates are zero are always bad macroeconomic conditions, and therefore, in my personal opinion, I would always trade a much stronger macroeconomy with a little bit higher interest rates, because it's a better business environment. If you can borrow for very low interest rates, but you can't do anything with the money, it may not be such a great benefit. The United States government, on the other hand, there are a lot of things that it could do with money that it can borrow effectively for free under current market conditions. So if you could advance to the next page, please. Now, let's get a little bit more granular and a little bit more specific about why should I care about any of this. We all care about it, I know, from the perspective of equitability. I think a lot, for example, about intergenerational equitability. I'm going to become a grandparent for the first time next March. I'm nerdy enough to think about the vast ocean of obligations that my generation are leaving to my grandchild's generation to finance and to pay for. But separate and distinct from those types of issues, it has a real tangible impact on things we care about right here, right now. And if you look at that graph on the right, this is a chart that's derived from the data provided by the USDA. As you all know, they produce these net farm income data. On the far right is their projection for 2020. The blue part of the bars are the intrinsic income earned and generated on the farm through regular farming activity, and the green bit is transfer payments from the federal government to farmers and ranchers around the country. My observation of this is that projection for 2020 of 36.2% of all U.S. net farm income coming from transfer payments, while that's a comforting thing for our agricultural customers and for rural America, I don't believe personally that anything like that amount of transfer payments are sustainable. I just do not. I think the political ability to sustain that level of transfer payments is not reasonable to expect to recur. Early on in my comments, I talked about the election results, and I tell you that there's a massive amount of interdependence between rural and urban America that is often goes unappreciated. This is a perfect example of that phenomena, and what I mean by that. That 36.2% doesn't come out of the sky, and it comes out of transfer payments from the taxpaying base of the United States. And the taxpaying base of the United States is substantially the urban, diverse population in San Francisco, Chicago, New York, and other parts of the country who are paying the per capita burdens of federal taxes that are getting distributed in a variety of ways, including in this way. And so I am focused, and we at CoBank and in the Farm Credit System with our partners are focused on the sustainability and the trajectory of the transfer payments and this indirect and direct supports that are provided to the agricultural economy and to farmers and ranchers across the country. And per my preceding pages, in the medium term, there will be, in my view, unrelenting downward pressure on federal programs to support agriculture and other rural industries because of the unsustainability of our fiscal trajectory that I've just described. It also indicates that because rural America in general and agriculture in particularly depend very substantially on that financial support from the federal government, it means that rural and agricultural America are substantially exposed to the results of federal elections. What happens in Congress and who controls the White House and what they think and want to do from a policy perspective matters a lot because it has direct impact on the sustainability of these payment structures and crop insurance programs, direct agricultural support payments, and the like. I would expect as a result of this election and the fiscal problems that we're going to see manifesting, that there will be an increasing amount of scrutiny at a national level on the spending and support networks for the rural economy in general and agriculture in particular as a consequence. That means, as I said, we at CoBank and in the Farm Credit System are militantly nonpartisan. We work with both sides across both sides of the aisle to try and facilitate policies that are supportive of rural America and agricultural America and the other industries in rural America that we serve, including water and communications and electric co-ops. And we're all going to need, and we are very focused on the need to have very robust dialogues and relationships with those stakeholders in the Congress in particular, in the White House as well, and to remain engaged so that we can manage those relationships and try and ensure that we don't have dramatically bad outcomes that come as these significant fiscal pressures start to intensify over the next few years. If you could advance one more page, please. Right, that takes us to the Q&A. At this point, I am sure there are people who are going to have either rebuttals or are going to be anxious or upset at the fact that I showed up as like a skunk at the garden party to talk about something as unpleasant as our unsustainable our national finances. But as I say, the job of leaders isn't to ignore problems or bury our head in the sand. It's to know what they are, identify what causes them, and try and anticipate what kinds of things we might want to do to be ready for them and to address them. This is one of the biggest challenges that the country faces once we get to the other side of COVID-19 and the economy starts to recover. And I suspect in the latter parts of my career, we're going to be spending a great deal of our national attention, and we in our industry and the industries that we serve are going to be affected by it dramatically because of the consequences, some of which I've described today. So Dave, I'm going to pause there and see what kinds of questions and comments we have. Of course, I'm happy to answer any questions on, the economy or interest rates or, any of the industries as well. But that's the main content that I wanted to put on the table and ask people to consider.
Tom, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. A couple housekeeping things before we start on the questions. I had one that Tom's handouts are available. If you click on the handouts section, you can access them there. If you're having trouble with that, we can certainly get those slides to you afterwards. Also, if you have a question, go to the question tab and submit it. I've got some that are coming in here, Tom. So maybe as we start the conversation, we'll get a few more. So let's start this off, Tom, with well, before I start, I got to just share with you, as I was sitting here listening to you, which I thought was fascinating, I'll bet your Thanksgiving dinner conversations are different than a lot of people's, though, aren't they, when you sit around the table?
I tell you what, you said in your kind introduction, believe it or not, I have a PhD in war studies, but it gets even more complicated because my wife also has a PhD in war studies. That's where we met in graduate school. So between her and me, we have some rather lively dinner time conversations. We make really good dinner guests.
Very strategic discussions, though, right?
Yeah.
So Tom, let's just start off with something very close to you. How has CoBank handled the working conditions as COVID has evolved, starting probably last February? But more importantly, what lessons have you learned in the last 8 months about how we can do business differently?
Great question. I tell you what, every dark cloud has a silver lining if you look for it. There are a couple that I think about a lot. One of which is I haven't been on an airplane since March 13th, and that's an extraordinary thing given what my job is ordinarily like. Number two, instead of a 30-minute commute in terrible traffic on I-25 in Denver to get to the office, I have a 30-second commute from the bedroom to another room where I can put my laptop. Number three, which is probably the most important actually, is modern technology. Some of this was here before, but I didn't utilize it very well, and a lot of people didn't utilize it very well. And I've discovered you can be incredibly effective and efficient using this technology. Now, it's not a substitute, 100% substitute for us being together, right? I would far prefer to be with everybody together. But that's gets to the answer of, we have been working remotely since March 16th. Now, we don't run a grain elevator or an electric co-op. We don't have people who are out in the field. We're an office business. We've got bankers who have phones and laptops and some space to sit. So we've run 95% remotely since March 16th. Now, and we had never prepared in the view that we thought we were going to have to work remotely for 8 months, let alone longer. But we have run remotely for a couple weeks at a time in the past. So all of our employees had laptops and technology and so forth. So we could basically say on a Friday afternoon, March 13th, we're going virtual on Monday. clear out your gear, take your laptops home. We're working from home. And we have worked from home without missing a beat that entire time. I mean, I can't find words to describe how proud I am of what our 1,150 employees have done. They've just done a tremendous job, and our results show that. But that's as much more a reflection of the fact that our customers are amazing, and our customers have adapted, and many of our customers have had the best results they've ever had because people need to buy more food because they're staying at home. And so people who produce shelf stable products are going 24/7 and they need more working capital, right? So we're probably going to have the best year in the history of the company. And we will have done it working almost the entire year remotely. It's really quite a phenomenal thing. Now, I would tell you, however, sorry, are you still there?
Yeah.
Oop, there we go. I lost my video, but can you see me?
Yes, Tom, you're fine.
Okay, good. I would say, I think a lot of things are actually going to be different. And one of the things that's going to be different is the economy is going to come back differently. I get up every day and I thank the Lord that I'm not the CEO of an airline or a hotel company or a restaurant chain. I think when recovery comes, it's going to look and feel different than what we have become used to. But and one of the things is that even for companies that are really successful, like most of your members and us and many of our partners in the farm credit system, we're probably going to come back and run our businesses a little bit differently. My suspicion is instead of me spending 70% of my time on planes flying around the country, going to events and seeing customers, I can see many, many more customers if I do some stuff in person and I do a lot of other stuff by videos. So for example, I've done 100 one-on-one CEO conversations with CEOs of our customers in recent weeks. I do them all the time. I can see a lot more people and have quality conversations by video than than I could see if I had to fly around the country and do them one at a time. So I think when we get to the other side, we're all going to find that we've done extraordinary things that nobody ever expected they would be forced to do. And while they didn't like it, they got better and accelerated a variety of changes that would have happened anyway. It's just that instead of happening over 5 years, they're going to happen over 1 year, right? And in some respects, we're going to be better off for it from an efficiency and productivity and innovation perspective.
So following that train of thought, Tom, for every action, there's a reaction. What happens to all the office buildings in Denver and Des Moines and New York if all these people don't have to commute that 30-minute commute to get to Greenland?
Great question. Again, I answer it partly and euphemistically by saying, my goodness, I'm so glad I don't lend to commercial real estate. Because the reality is, it's going to change the way people work and run their businesses. And since we're predominantly a services economy, that's people in physical spaces. And I think that's going to have a long-term reduction of the demand curve for commercial office buildings space. It'll be stronger in some places and weaker in others, but it'll definitely change the demand curve for commercial office space, in my humble opinion. As an ancillary statement to that, however, I also would tell you, I think this is a great opportunity for rural places, right? Because if you are, people can't commute if they live in New York or Chicago or San Francisco or Los Angeles. They can't commute 3 hours a day, right? So it clearly, in all those big urban places with 5-10 million people in them, a lot of those people are either going to move out to the suburbs or move even further commuting distance, or buy a second home and spend the weekend in the country. But some people will just decide, you know what, because of the way things are changing, I'm not going to live in San Francisco ever again. So there are a lot of people, for example, in Silicon Valley who are like, taken their job with them and they're moving to Idaho or Montana or Wyoming or Denver or what have you, because their employer tells them you can work wherever the heck you want, in which case they get to choose. And on the one hand, that's really good for people to bring high-paying jobs and consumer demand and other things to more rural places. On the other hand, if you're one of the rural people who've lived there all your life, and somebody shows up from San Francisco and doubles the cost of housing and other stuff in my local community, you may find that irritating. But it does have potentiality, in my humble opinion, for rural America, particularly in places that are attractive to folks who can do their job from anywhere.
So Tom, we're getting a lot of questions here, but I'm going to take this a little out of order, excuse me, because I'm getting several questions about broadband. And the scenario you just described, it seems to me the limiting factor in a lot of those cases is reliable, dependable broadband access are table stakes for me to do my job remotely. And yet you don't have to move to Montana and Idaho. We have spots in Iowa where we don't have reliable, dependable broadband. How does the country address this issue? We've been talking about it for years, but how do we finally address that issue?
Great question. You know, CoBank has been one of the largest investors in rural communications industry for decades. It's a really big and very important part of what we do. But if we'd had this conversation 5 years ago, there would have been a bunch of people in the audience who would have been probably a little bit less convinced that somehow that was a super urgent priority and that the country should be mobilized and that there should be ubiquitous, high quality broadband available to everybody everywhere in America. But people would have been like, oh, really? You know, that's number 19 on my list. Nobody can say that today. You're completely right? Today, broadband has the same degree of urgency and importance as electricity did in the 1930s. When the Rural Electrification Act came along, everybody's like, okay, we must to make this country, stitch this country together and have equitability, we must have electricity everywhere, no matter where you are, no matter how remote, no matter how low your population density is. Today, that's exactly the same for broadband, right? And here's another silver lining in COVID. There's nobody anywhere who can take issue with that, right? Doesn't matter whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or what your political persuasion is, or what state you're from. Everybody would say, yeah, okay, I get that. That is a true statement. We all agree with that. The question then becomes, okay, so what are we going to do about it? My friend Beth Ford, the CEO of Land O'Lakes, who runs a gigantic, dairy and food business, has become one of the biggest advocates for rural broadband, precisely for that reason, right? And I say to our agricultural customers, it's like your farmers and ranchers and your ag co-ops, for example, their members, they can't be as productive as modern technology would allow them to be unless they have high quality internet, right? They can't drag a cable along behind the tractor in the fields to ensure that they have it. It must be mobile, right? It must be wireless. So the good news is everybody agrees on that. The bad news is it's really hard and it's complicated and it takes financial resources. And while we have been dramatically continuing to grow our own business, there is, in the same way there was in the 1930s in electrification, there's a big delta there between what's commercially financeable, things that we can do, for example, versus what is not, right? So when we did electrification and when we did telephony to rural America, you had to create a whole financing mechanism, because if you live in a part of the country where there's 2 people per mile, you can't bring broadband there and have it be economically viable. There's not enough revenue. You can't charge those people the cost recovery levels. So you've got to come up, like we did when we brought telephony across rural America, you got to come up with a financing mechanism that will take money from the places where there's tons of it and create resource pools that will finance the distribution of that technology to places where there aren't enough people to financially support it on a standalone basis. And that's where the rubber meets the road and where it becomes more challenging because, you know, nobody wants to fix a budget deficit, but even though they would all agree on something as important as broadband all over the country, when you get down to the question of, well, who are you going to pay for it and how are you going to structure it, you start losing people because like, well, I don't want to pay for it. I want them to pay for it. I want those people to pay for it. I want urban people to pay for it. And then it becomes more challenging. I am hopeful that there will be a desire in a world in the short term, in the next year or two, where real interest rates are negative, where the Congress of the United States and the new administration will be able to put together an infrastructure package which would have a meaningful contribution towards rural investing activity, of which broadband would need to be a really, really important priority. And the good news is that a lot more people would agree with that. It's probably be unanimous. Everybody agrees with the principle of it, although the implementation would be more challenging.
Good. Thank you, Tom. So I'm gonna put a little firewall around you and not make this political, but I've got a plethora of questions here about the effect the elections are going to have on the economy. And I can drill down into specific questions, but let's just start at 10,000 feet. I think we can agree we have a president now. Senate's probably still a little bit up in the air, and we have a House of Representatives. What effect does that have on the economy?
Well, fiscal and monetary policy matter a lot to the macroeconomic performance. Obviously, monetary policy is completely in the hands of the Fed, and they'll do what they think is right, and we can have a high degree of confidence that they are professional and proficient at what they do, and I don't worry about them at all. Fiscal policy, on the other hand, is in the hands of the Congress and the White House. All spending and revenue bills have to originate in the House of Representatives, and so our divided politics and so forth is challenging. And as you say, the runoff for the two seats in Georgia in the United States Senate is massively important, right? Because if the Democrats win both, they will control the Senate through the use of the vice president as a tiebreaker. If they don't control both, then the Republicans will control the Senate and they will use their position power to ruthless effect. And that will make it harder to legislate, as experience demonstrates. So the answer to how much does it matter depends on what happens in those two Georgia Senate races. If, for example, the Democrats control both the Senate and the House and the White House, that will create a condition in which you can expect to see a great deal more legislation, a great deal more quickly, that would have a tendency to be more expansionary in nature. They have a lot of things they want to spend money on. And things that they want to do, none of which are going to reduce the budget deficit, by the way. But if the Republicans control the Senate, it'll be a lot harder to do a lot of those things. And in that environment, I would expect to see less things in the form of legislation, and more things be done in the form of administrative actions out of executive branch agencies. And executive actions from the president. So, for example, under the Trump administration, a lot has changed in the activities of the Environmental Protection Agency, and that has affected all kinds of industries, but certainly agriculture. That's not legislation. That's just a different regime who wants to do different things within the four corners of what the EPA can do under prevailing legislation. And I would certainly expect that the new administration would have a very different set of priorities in that regard, and I think we will see a lot of activity coming out of the Department of Agriculture, the Environmental Protection Agency, and all those other places that will look and feel quite different than what we've had for the last 3.5 years. At the end of the day, do these things decide whether we grow at 2% or grow at 0%? No, I mean, mostly what the trajectory of the macroeconomy is the aggregation of the activity of 330 million consumers and thousands and thousands of businesses in this country, and that's what generates the economic output. But what government does and how it does it does have an impact. It can either make it slower or make it faster on the margin, and that's demonstrated particularly at times like this when you have an exogenous shock like COVID-19. And while in the same way that in 2008, when we had this huge polarizing political debate about whether we should do a stimulus package then, and the Republicans and Democrats were at loggerheads, and they took out these votes, and the stock market collapsed, and eventually they agreed to it. Nobody liked it, because if you're the person in a position of responsibility who's had to advocate for something like that, and the only thing you can say is, I know you all hate it, and I know that the circumstances are really bad, but if we didn't do this, it would be much worse. That's the same as the situation we're in now, right? We've spent $2 trillion in COVID relief packages. We've driven interest rates down to zero. Everyone's squealing all over the country that the economy is terrible and we should do this or we shouldn't do that. It's likely to get worse before it gets better. But the fact of the matter is, if we didn't do $2 trillion of stimulus earlier this year, and if we hadn't driven interest rates down to zero, whatever we have now would have been much worse, right? And over the next 6 to 12 months, if we don't do more to support the economy and to eradicate COVID, it will get worse. And so hard as that is to grapple with, when you're in a position of leadership and power and responsibility, you got to do the right thing, even though not everybody likes it.
Thank you, Tom. So I'm going to take the liberty of combining 2 or 3 references I've had here. With the expectation the new administration is going to be more supportive of climate change, carbon exchanges, is that a threat or an opportunity for agriculture?
Yes and yes. It all depends on your frame of reference. Sometimes your greatest problems, either in your personal life, your professional life, or your business, sometimes the biggest threats and biggest challenges turn into your biggest opportunities, right? That's the way I like to think about it. I think some of the worst things I've experienced in my career got me better faster and got me ready for the next opportunity, right? Same thing can be said about businesses. And I think the fact of the matter is, whether it's this administration or if Trump had been reelected, kind of regardless of who's in the White House, which matters on the margin, right? It can affect the trajectory of these things on the margin. But over the long run, the economy is driven by innovation, technological change, demand, stuff like that. And I'll give you illustrate that with an example. Under the Obama administration, some of the members in the room would remember the Clean Power Plan, right? They were all about attacking greenhouse gas emissions, and the Clean Power Plan was one of a vast array of things that they were trying to do to try and address global warming, climate change, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the United States via coal-fired power plants, et cetera. That all got thrown away when Trump was elected, of course, but guess what? Greenhouse gas emissions from those sources are lower today than they would have been had we executed the Clean Power Plan as intended. How is that possible, you might ask? Well, the answer is technological change, right? The power complex in the United States is undergoing dramatic, rapid change. Renewables are growing rapidly. The prospect of scalable, cost-effective storage capacity changes the dynamics for renewables, and of course, solar power has come down by is 10% of the cost of what it was a decade ago, right? You see long-term power purchase agreements struck on renewable energy at sub 4 cents a kilowatt hour. If you'd asked if that were possible 5 years ago, you would have said, you're crazy, that'll never happen in my lifetime, but it's already here, right? So that's, so you got to look at what's really going on away from the politics, understand the fundamental mega drivers in your industry, that are going to drive things inexorably, and then understand how policy can make that happen faster or slower, and then you want to get ahead of those things. And I think the fact of the matter is, for example, what's happening in the power complex, I would view as an opportunity, right? If you position yourself in the right way. I'll give you an example to illustrate this. About 2 months ago, a customer of ours called Next Era Energy, they're a renewables power company, solar and wind. Their market capitalization on the stock market exceeded the market capitalization of ExxonMobil. If you'd asked me 5 years ago, is that possible? I would have said, absolutely not in my lifetime. It already has happened. This company that didn't exist 15 years ago has a market capitalization bigger than ExxonMobil, one of the 7 majors in the in the world petrochemical industry. Well, you could have sat on your hands and said that renewables weren't an opportunity 10 years ago, and you would have missed a huge opportunity that's still got a long way to run. So my mantra for people is nothing's 100% a threat or 100% an opportunity. You got to be nimble on your toes and look at the threat and figure out how to turn it into an opportunity.
Thank you, Tom. I want to come in that I think is kind of interesting. It's referring back to your first slide, the red and blue map. And I would just share with you that Iowa would be a microcosm of that. We have 99 counties and probably 91 of those would be bright red. What happens is, in your example, where the San Francisco resident moves to Idaho and we start to change the demographics of those politics?
Well, the reality is the demographics of our politics are always constantly changing. It doesn't seem or feel like that on any given day because it happens relatively slowly. But then if you back up and look at it over a long period of time, your lifetime, for example, and you look at the political affiliations and voter behaviors in different parts of the country, they've changed a lot in my lifetime. And it's like the water, it's constantly churning, right, through demographic change. The impact of the last 3 decades of immigration have dramatically transformed a lot of places, right? If you look at my family's hometown of Eagle Grove, Iowa, population 3,000 in Wright County, it looked a lot different when I was a little kid there than it looks today in terms of who lives there, what kinds of things that they do, what they think, how they might vote, etc. And that's just constantly happening. And you can like it or not like it, it's just constantly happening, and it will continue to constantly happen, and it will have demographic and social and political consequences over time as the complexion of places from a red versus blue perspective continue to evolve. I'll give you an example. Up until about 25 years ago, California was a reliably Republican voting presidential state, right? Imagine that, right? Republicans haven't won the state of California since Ronald Reagan, right? They're not likely to win the state of California in presidential election in my lifetime. But look at how rapidly that changed and how dramatically it has changed. And different countries change; they just do it over different periods of time, and I expect that to continue.
Tom, I think and I maybe take one last question here because I know you got to run to another meeting. One of the things that got exposed through the whole COVID was weak links in our supply chain. In Iowa, we saw a dramatic impact of the meatpacking industry. Have we learned anything from that, and will we do anything different to try and address that concern, or are we just going to pretend like it didn't happen and move on?
It's a great question, and I'm very sensitive to that because we have so many customers that have all over the place and all parts of that, and all of the big meatpacking companies in this country are customers of ours. And I spoke to the CEOs of most of those companies back in the March-April time period when things were really under a lot of stress. And I learned a lot. I think a lot of people came to the realization that through the rational application of market forces, we'd gotten super efficient, but we've also become quite concentrated. There's a relatively small number of companies in the business, and they have concentrated to capture scale economies. They've concentrated their activities down to a small number of really large industrial sites. So I think those 4 companies have, I could be wrong here, but I think they have like 75 to 80 giant plants. And that's a lot of, and then when you find out that the infectious disease problem you have is at its worst when people are working in close proximity under cold conditions, well, guess what? That's what a meatpacking plant is. Close proximity, people standing together for hours at a time in a cold work environment. And so I think there's a lot more people who realize that, and meatpacking is just one example, but it's a poignant one, that look at that and go, wow, that's really interesting. That's an issue. That's a potential vulnerability that doesn't just affect those 4 companies. It affects the country, food security, public health, blah, blah, blah. So I think that you'll probably see, depending on who populates, key jobs in a new administration, it may be that people look at that and go, you know what, we should have a view on that from a public policy perspective, and not just leave it purely to market forces to decide how concentrated or otherwise that they should be. But I would say that's a nice to do kind of challenge as opposed to a must do kind of challenge. So whether the government of the United States has the ability and the willingness to address that issue when they have so many other issues that are like burning houses that they have to deal with that are more urgent, remains to be seen. But I think we've learned a lot about resiliency and concentration, not just in the protein complex, but in other parts of our agricultural economy. And it has helped, I think, to remind people who otherwise don't think about rural America in general, or particularly the agricultural economy, that food security is not a nice to have. It's strategically important to the health and national security of the United States of America, and we need to ensure that it remains so, and that the entire complex, from the farmer and rancher, dairy person down at the bottom of the pyramid all the way up through the distribution chains, are safe and secure and resilient, and that's not an interest just for the producer or for people in rural America. It's absolutely essential for the country, because when you have a city with 10 or 15 million people in it and they can't get food because the grocery store doesn't have any protein in it, for example, that's a big problem, and we don't want to have that problem recur.
Tom, it's about noon. I know you have another meeting you need to jump to. I just want to share with you that we could go for a couple more hours, because I have gotten inundated with questions, and that's kudos to you that people really enjoy your responses and insight on things. And again, I apologize to all of you that submitted questions. We simply don't have enough time to get to all of them. So Tom, with that, I'd certainly like to take the opportunity to thank you, to thank CoBank, and to wish you and your family a very happy Thanksgiving.
Well, I appreciate it very much, Dave. I appreciate everyone's attention and the opportunity to be with you. I hope that the scourge of COVID-19 passes us sooner rather than later, and that we can all start to see each other in a more normalized context. I suppose for all of you, like for me, you love the work you do, you love the mission you serve, you love the customers that you serve, but the relationships with people, be they your colleagues or your customers or stakeholders, is a really, really important part of what makes our collectively makes our jobs satisfying and important to us. And it's my hope that we'll get to a point in the not too distant future where we can start to return to more of that. In the meantime, I wish everyone a healthy and safe, not just Thanksgiving, but holiday period.
Thank you, Tom. With that, thank you so much for all of you for joining us today. It was new, it was different, courtesy of all my coworkers that are sitting here beside me, it went off without any snafus that I'm aware of, or not too many anyway. So with that, I'd certainly like to thank each of you for joining us, and I want to wish you a very happy and safe Thanksgiving. And thank you again.